Welcome, everyone. This is a subject that's really near and dear to my heart. I think we've seen a lot of organizations struggle and skin their knees with their social collaboration strategies. A lot of different reasons for that, but I think a number of problems get born in the creation where they default to a particular tool or vendor because they have it lying around. We saw that for years with SharePoint and to some extent now with Office 365. And, what I want to try to provide today is a more proactive, a more intentional way of making these decisions. And really come by this, I think, pretty honestly. I founded Real Story Group, formerly CMS Watch, 17 years ago because of a quadrant like this. I was working at a systems integrator where I was the head of the engineering and implementation teams, and we were trying to implement some early versions of some of these tools, including collaboration and information management tools from Interwoven and Documentum and IBM and Oracle and others. And vendors that were routinely in the so-called upper right or winners quadrant, and running into constant problems implementing these tools. And our clients would ask us, hey, why is that? What's the problem? Gartner and Forrester have them rated up here in the top right. Maybe there's something wrong with you. And what I really discovered is there's something wrong with the analyst industry here, and that there's got to be a better way of telling a real story. So I founded Real Story Group to exclusively help you, the enterprise customer, make better choices based on more deeper and more independent and honestly more skeptical research. So that's what you're going to hear today. And first, we're going to talk a little bit about the social collaboration, the broader digital workplace tech landscape, and then get into some nitty-gritty about what's the best way to select these tools. So, here's a typical kind of digital workplace layer cake diagram. It's an enterprise architecture diagram. These are useful, particularly for doing inventories, and it shows a sort of logical view of the world. And you can see the collaboration and social networking right there in the middle where it should be. But the problem with this sort of approach is that it's the enterprise view of itself. And so what's missing here, obviously, is the employee. So we came up with a second reference model, which is an employee-centered digital workplace reference model. And so this shows really from the desires and goals and outcomes of the employee, and looking at this from an employee-centered design perspective, and then working their way outward through the red and ultimately blue and gray and purple about what do we need to do then to enable them to work better, both as individuals and as teams. And so obviously social and collaboration capability is really critical here. The difference between the gray and the blue is the gray is the business platforms, which is obviously the technologies, but the interesting part about the blue is those are the specific applications. And that's going to be one of the themes of this presentation, as well as many others that we give, is that we may think in terms of vendors, but employees think in terms of applications that are going to make them more effective and more recognized at work. And so that's the approach that we're going to take as well. And that's interesting because when you take that approach, it often leads you to some very different selection decisions. A lot of different vendors out there, including in collaboration and communication. This is the MPEX chart that we developed earlier, kind of looking at this from an employee experience perspective. Obviously, a lot of different things that influence it, but once again, collaboration and communication and social networking are really critical. I would say table stakes to having an effective employee-centered digital workplace. In other words, you can get a lot of other things right, but if you get social collaboration wrong, that's going to be a serious inhibitor in terms of developing an effective employee-centric digital workplace environment. So let's look specifically at this marketplace then. You obviously have a lot of choices. Many organizations historically have kind of defaulted to the platform vendors, IBM, Microsoft, now pushing Office 365 and Oracle. Historically, this has been a very uneven sort of strategy. This is sort of saying, okay, we have this lying around, or we have this relationship with this vendor, let's just go with them. And so it's an easy decision. Sometimes, honestly, it's kind of a lazy decision because you're not really thinking about it from the employee perspective. Fortunately, there are a number of other specialist players, including major suites from the likes of Drupal, Atlassian, Google, Jive, and others, as well as, of course, a number of specialist players, Harmony, Slack, others, And then smaller suites are kind of interesting. Some of these are intranets in a box, can be good for mid-range, mid-level solution, mid-level sized enterprises. And then on the far right, you've got social enterprise layers. Some people think of these as enterprise social networks. We would encourage you to think of them more as kind of a layer in your overall infrastructure to the extent that you can. Not always easy to execute on that, but obviously these sort of social capabilities are key components here. So how do you then go about implementing or selecting these, implementing a selection process and then evaluating these tools? So the traditional way of doing this is to look at it from a feature perspective. So here's some of the features that we look at in terms of vendor capabilities, and this is from our review of Facebook Workplace. So you can break this down into productivity, collaboration, and then of course, very important to look at sort of enterprise-wide services, particularly if you're going to scale this from a pilot to enterprise-wide solution. We often run into what we call the enterprise surprise when people try to take a pilot, sometimes done in IT, and then spread it across the enterprise. So yeah, this is useful. It kind of says, what does it do? And this often then leads to checklist type RFPs, which unfortunately is kind of a dead end. So even though we do some of these evaluations, this isn't really what we focus on in terms of, this helps you understand what the product does from kind of a services perspective, but it doesn't tell you whether it's going to be a good fit for you. This is not an employee-centric way of doing it. So how do you then get to that gap? How do you get to this, close this gap between the executive level? We have these aspirations, we want to collaborate more, and then at a staff level, you have more instrumental and practical kind of concerns, which is what we need the right answers, right? And from everything we've seen over the last 18 years, is that it's really business applications close this gap, right? So they're not platforms, they're not features, right? It's something in between platforms and features, and it's around specific business applications. And what's so interesting and fascinating and beguiling and exciting about the social collaboration space is just how many different business applications there are. And there's a case to be made for any one of these. The question is, which ones are going to be higher priority in your enterprise? So we have formal knowledge bases for policies, procedures, and that sort of thing, external collaboration, project collaboration. And project collaboration, seems kind of old school. Many organizations are still struggling to do it well. What we think about here is really accelerating repeatable team efforts. So the key thing here is to have, templated spaces. Team communication. So this is the thing that kind of Slack taught us. This is very important to quickly coordinate small group tasks. Communities of practice, community of interest, really different than projects, and you don't want to use project software to support communities. We know for a fact that communities are the tip of the social spear, and that doing this well can be extremely effective, both for communities of practice and communities of interest. And then there's specialized types of communities like ideation and innovation support. Obviously, enterprise conversation to socialize change across the organization, social Q&A to deliver answers. Very effective application, has to be very specifically designed for this, even though it runs on forum features. It's an actual social Q&A application, and obviously expertise location critical in larger enterprises. And then some organizations, they have these legacy work streams and they want to try to socialize them. So that's where you often see tools from, say, SAP or from Salesforce that are trying to provide a social layer on top of their own environment to sort of humanize some of these legacy applications and make them more naturally social. So the key thing is to look at these and understand which ones do you need and which ones do you really want to prioritize. There's a case to be made for all of these, but maybe you don't necessarily want to execute on all of them. But the even more important thing is you're not going to find a single vendor, or arguably even two vendors, that are good across all of these. So that's why you really need to prioritize and make some choices and some decisions. So let's go back to, for example, again, Workplace by Facebook. Really interesting tool, a lot of good things going forward, including global reach, relatively low cost, localization, good performance, good mobile story. So, but when you look at it, when you take it away from that kind of feature set and the whole buzz around the Facebook name, and you ask yourself from a business perspective, what applications is this really delivering? Man, the story gets a little bit thinner. So if we look at this in terms of those sort of canonical applications, Facebook is pretty good at conversation and news at the bottom there, right? So it excels at standalone social networking and conversation. The problem with standalone social networking conversations is they tend not to be integrated into other solutions. And so it sort of forces you to go to a special place to be social, as opposed to incorporating social networking more naturally into the flow of people's work. It's okay for communities. It has some team communications and some external support, but it doesn't really have a story for all the rest of the stuff. So it's actually, ironically, kind of a niche product. But if all you're looking for is conversation and news, then it could suffice for you. Of course, that's looking at what the product can actually do. There's other key strategic considerations here, including the vendor and product ecosystem. And so this is really important as well. And you know, not just what does the technology do, but is there a customer community around it? And we find that the breadth of the customer community and the partner community is the best predictor of the longevity of that particular technology. And so there's a lot to consider here as well. And this has become a key part of our evaluations as well. So once again, turning back to Facebook Workplace, you know, one of the issues with it is it doesn't really have a lot of vendor professional services. In fact, the vendor commitment feels a little bit light to us, and that's probably the biggest strategic risk with Facebook Workplace, is that it's not a core part of Facebook's business. And we know before that even large vendors, and we've seen this with Google, will suddenly turn on a dime and get rid of applications in the enterprise space when they're fundamentally a consumer vendor. So I think that's the biggest strategic risk with Facebook, and one of the reasons why we give it low scores. In terms of the product, you know, it is modern, it's relatively low cost, so we give it high product scores. But then the real killer around Facebook is the somewhat weak ecosystem around it. And I think Facebook is trying to work on this, but they really underestimated the importance of an ecosystem in an enterprise context. Maybe also they thought because they're Facebook, it wouldn't matter. So there's some significant weaknesses here that you need to consider around Facebook if you're looking at this in a strategic context, something that you want to be able to run in your enterprise, not for just a year, but ideally 2 or 3 years. And you know, if you've had different ESN projects in your company, that the switching costs can be quite high. So you really want to make a good choice around this. Once again, I'll pause and remind you that if you have any questions at all, feel free to use the questions tab in your Go to Webinar Control Panel, or if there's anything you disagree with or want to agree with, and we'll have a little bit of a conversation around that. Okay. So that's looking at the digital workplace, why social collaboration is table stakes, how to look at the marketplace as a whole and get beyond some of the major platform vendors, and then looking at, you know, what are some of the evaluation criteria that you want. So now, how do you go about actually selecting tools? Well, don't do this. Don't take a big platform that you have and try to use it just because you have it lying around. And so this is really a critical thing, particularly around Office 365. And I think that and this is always the case with SharePoint, and historically we've seen this with IBM and Oracle as well. To a lesser extent with Salesforce and Google, that you know, you already have some commitment to some other piece in their toolkit, so you're going to use it even for this. And it becomes heavy and overbearing, and you end up having to explain the technology to your employees rather than your employees actually using it naturally. Because, you know, when you try to use the wrong tool for the wrong thing, it can be painful, and sometimes it's catastrophic. So, you know, there are risks here. From an IT perspective, maybe it's easier to reuse something, but from an employee perspective, not always the case. But what you really don't want to do, though, in a selection process is just say, hey, look at this cool tool. Let's just try it and hope it goes okay. You don't want to be experimenting with your employees. So how do we do this in a kind of non-guesswork sort of way? So what we really want to get to is a more agile-ish selection, something that applies design thinking to the selection process. And so you can pick up this book that my colleague Jared and I wrote, which really talks about building a team, using a test-based approach, and then iterating and adapting so that you have a more real process as opposed to something that's very waterfall-like. So obviously you want to build an interdisciplinary selection team, which for social collaboration would include HR, KM, definitely marketing and sales, because they often are very heavy users of these platforms. potentially, obviously whatever stands for your intranet or digital workplace team, really critical here. And of course, various elements of IT, enterprise architects, developers, so on and so forth, to build an interdisciplinary selection team. But really critical that team is led by a business stakeholder, right? And then you go through a testable process, right? And so we're big believers in research. You can use research to get down to a short list of RFP recipients. We have tools that help you get there using those scenario analysis and the strategic considerations to get to what we call a real quadrant rather than a magic quadrant. But then you want to narrow down through a series of scripted demos and then ultimately a bake-off. And Oscar, will get to your question around bake-offs here as well. Bake-offs are really important because demos are what the vendor actually shows you. Bake-offs are actual prototypes that you run internally, hands-on with real people, running real projects with them. And then okay, this is going to work for our employees or not. And the way to do this is not through spreadsheets, lists of features. The vendors have seen them, they can check all the boxes. What you want to do is develop testable scenarios, right? And so these are employee journeys, can also be developer journeys, designer journeys, internet manager journeys, whatever. But the key thing is that the majority of these are actual employee journeys, people who are trying to actually accomplish specific tasks and get work done and be more effective and be more recognized within the enterprise for that success. And so having these narrative stories is what you build upon in any RFP, what the vendors come in and demo, and then what you test. And the good thing is, as an adaptive process, you can then modify these stories along the way as you learn about yourselves and about the technology. So this is really the opposite of the feature-based waterfall approach. In the end, it's all about fit, getting the right business fit, the right technology fit, the right partner fit, the right value fit. A lot of what we do with our subscribers is to help kind of adjudicate some of these decisions or facilitate some of these decisions where, it's never an easy story that, you may have one solution like Yammer that you've already licensed and it's lying around, but it's not working for you. And why is it not working for you? It could be a variety of different reasons for that, but it could also be that it's just a poor business fit for the things you're trying to do with social technology, particularly if something like community is really important to you. So at the end of the day, the business scenario fit really should trump all, but the other ones obviously are very critical as well. So we've got a lot of great questions and comments coming in, so I'm just going to look at them really quickly. Scott's going to talk to you about some potential next steps here, and then we'll turn to what's going to be, I think, a very interesting conversation here. If you have any more questions or comments, though, feel free to put them in the GoToWebinar control panel. So Scott.
Great, thanks, Tony. Excellent presentation, and we do have a few questions. But before we get to those, I do want to mention that you can actually download a free excerpt from our research by clicking on the link there, realstorygroup.com/try, and you can download an excerpt from our social collaboration research or from any of the other research areas we cover. I also invite you to try out the tools that's Tony mentioned, such as the Real Quadrant application. So you can see exactly which use cases we're using to measure those solutions and try to start to narrow down your short list of potential vendors. The other thing I'd mention as well, if you have follow-up questions from the presentation or want to learn more about becoming a Real Story Group subscriber, just drop us a line at explore@realstorygroup.com. So with that, Tony, you have several questions in the queue there, I see.
Yeah, so Oscar's asking, what would be the best approach to pilot two different tools to select the best one, let's say Workplace versus Yammer? So the approach, Oscar, is really to not just kind of throw them out there and say, hey, we've got these social networks, try them out, but to really think about them in the context of particular work streams and what people are trying to do and really put them through those paces against those key applications. And, we've seen this done successfully in a couple different ways. One is to have different teams trying them out. One is to have the same team try both. The second one feels more scientific, but in this case can be kind of tricky with ESNs in particular. So we've seen like two different teams sometimes using them. The key thing is you don't have different departments. So you have IT try Yammer and then marketing try Workplace. What you want is a mix of people trying both. And also maybe guiding them a little bit and giving them some scripts to say, hey, try this out, or try to, get this project team to use this. What actually happened, and then get people together and measure the results. Catherine's asking, what are your perspectives on Jive post-acquisition? So Jive has gone through, a couple of different tumbles here. I think that initially we were and are still somewhat sanguine on the separation of the kind of external-facing Jive community technology from the internal-facing technology. Having said that, the acquisition, like many acquisitions, has been a little bit bumpy in terms of a lack of continuity and some concerns about the future roadmap. And so that has given us some pause, and we've actually sort of downgraded them from a viability standpoint in terms of our own scoring and our own decision tools. And so we're kind of in wait and see mode. I'm not in a situation where I'm thinking this is a death spiral or it's a prohibitively bad choice, but it is sort of giving some pause for a quarter or two to check in. Micah's asking, he thinks the ecosystem criteria is truly critical. Seems really hard to evaluate this. Any suggestions? Also, how do you measure the level of investment in ecosystem? So, it's a great question. We try to do, our own evaluations of these criteria and put some numbers behind them. I think that, one of the things that an iterative selection process does is give you the chance to not just interact with the vendor salespeople, but also interact with support and implementation teams and also the broader ecosystem. So the first thing you'd want to do then is to, try out their support docs, to get into some of the forums. If it's a really critical thing, then go to one of the conferences, which is also an interesting question. Are there actually local user groups? Are there conferences you can go to? If you have to go pretty far and it's only once a year, then that, could be a measure that, this is a somewhat smaller vendor with a somewhat lighter ecosystem. If you are likely to engage a partner in the implementation, which many of us do, then assessing the partners along with assessing the vendors is always a good idea. And we've done some really interesting combo selection processes where we were vetting not just the implementation, not just the software vendor, but the implementation teams as well. Sometimes even having a two-stage process where the enterprise selected a particular tool, and then after that went through the same kind of iterative hands-on testing with implementation partners. And that was really revealing because implementation partners can really differ in terms of methodology, their understanding of your needs, and quite honestly, the depth of their expertise in that particular tool. Okay, so the next question is from Tony. Single vendor or can best of breed work well? If we look at that MPEX chart that we have, Tony, I think the future is probably some major platforms, but definitely a lot of best of breed. And what we've seen on the digital marketing side, on the customer side, which usually is a good predictor of what's going to happen on the digital workplace side, is that there's been a Cambrian explosion of very specialized vendors. And I think we're going to see that on the digital workplace side as well. And so you have to be able to mix and match platforms and best of breed. And the digital workplace, leaders of the future are just going to have to get good at that. Jeff is asking, I love the bake-off method, but working in government organizations, the RP methodology makes things like a bake-off difficult. This is true. It's interesting. We've seen in the U.S. federal government some changes in that regard. The other thing that's interesting is that if you can find a more pliable contracts officer, you often find that there are provisions. They're just sometimes deeply hidden, and the contracts people don't want to do them because it seems like more work, and there's a bigger chance for the solicitation to be challenged by the losing vendor. But Jeb, we often find if you look deeper, if you push, sometimes there are means and mechanisms. It's just that you need to instill confidence that you have a structure and a plan around this. And then hopefully my wish would be to find a pliable kind of contract officer who could help you out. So let's see. I think we are coming up against the bottom of the hour. Nope, we've got room for a couple more questions. Is there a recording available, Daniel? If your firm is a subscriber, you'll get the full recording. If not, then you'll definitely get the platform. Tony's asking, social seems to be going a bit by the wayside in favor of Slack Teams conversations. What's my point of view? I think they're two very different things, and that's why we evaluate them in different contexts. I think that we should take notice that the conversations apps took off because they solved a very specific need, and that should be sobering to all of us who just want to kind of throw social at people and push them to adapt it, is that here's something that actually helped them get their work done, and we really need to be disciplined about that. And the nice thing about employee-centered design is that it should be teaching us stuff like that. And so, my POV around social is less around this kind of enterprise-wide kumbaya conversation and more around very specific socially fueled applications like communities, like ideation, like social Q&A. Sony's also asking, Yammer still seems to be the redheaded stepchild for Microsoft. What do you think are the prospects? I don't know. Microsoft goes hot and cold on this. I think they acquired Yammer not for the technology, but for some of the methodologies and other things. And, my sense around it is that it's going to continue to be sort of an unloved stepchild, but Microsoft has to kind of keep it in their portfolio. Lisa's asking, and a couple of others asked, when running pilots of different tools, what recommendation can you give on gathering feedback from users or basically measuring the success of each platform? Yeah, that's a great question. And so usually what we'll do is break down the different evaluation criteria into spreadsheets and have them rank them much the way we do with Harvey Balls from kind of 0 to 4. 0 being complete fail, 4 being kind of exceed expectations, and do that on a scenario by scenario basis. So remember, you have these different user journeys, and really using the journeys as a way of kind of disciplining and structuring your evaluation requirements works really well. Jeb is saying there are FAR considerations, FAR is the federal acquisition process, that make it not possible, I believe. FAR does have some limitations, but I have definitely seen people use this process in the federal space, and there are provisions in FAR to do bake-offs. You often have to pay the bidders to participate, but even in the private sector, you often have to do that too. And yes, there are issues around connecting with existing data, so you have to ask them to come to the party with dummy data and other sorts of things. So there definitely, Jeb, there are challenges in the U.S. federal space, as there are in many national and local governments, but it's not totally impossible. It just is an additional challenge, and my wish for you is to be able to overcome some of those challenges. Okay, so now we have really reached the bottom of the half hour. Wanted to thank all of you for participating, your great feedback here. If your enterprise could use this kind of advice on an ongoing basis, please feel free to get in touch with Scott, and we'll continue the conversation. So for Scott Dill, this is Tony Byrne from Real Story Group, signing off and wishing you a great rest of your week. Bye now.